All right. Good morning, Doug. How are you today?
I'm fine and properly decked out. I'm sporting, as you can tell, a white 1950s Marlon Brando-ish James Deanish T-shirt, showing that I not only talk the talk but walk the walk sometimes.
Right.
So
And this is referring to the ultimate of men's fashion. We did a great, very funny video on that yesterday. If you missed it, I encourage you to go check it out. Lots of good laughs there, I think you'll find.
exactly. So anyway, that's one thing carrying over from yesterday. Second thing I wanted to mention before we get into something substantial. Well, this is substantial too. I go on Quora a lot, and it's a time waster because there are a lot of trivial and meaningless comments, but on everything under the sun. But one of the threads that I'm on in Quora is a military thread, and one of the people that writes most for it is an ex-German paratrooper named Roland Bartsko. And he's showed pictures of himself in various situations. He's a veteran of the Kosovo and Bosnia wars. I don't know how much time he spent fighting there when they were going on, but quite a bit, I think. And Roland's I think he's about 50 now. And so since war is a young man's game, he's not participating in this dust up in the Ukraine. However, he's since he was fighting basically Serbians when he was in Bosnia and Kosovo, he's naturally inclined against the Russians, who were longtime allies of the Serbians. Anyway, this is interesting, I think, in that Roland makes real boots on the ground, hands-on comments about these type of things. He's in the Ukraine. He's been in the Ukraine for some time, not fighting, but supplying the Ukrainians with clothing and field equipment and food and things like that that soldiers need that they can't get easily. Anyway, he responded to a question from one of his readers saying, somebody who decided he'd like to be like Ernest Hemingway in the 30s and go and get in a war since the U.S. Doesn't have any legitimate wars, well, not that it has for decades and decades. But somebody wrote him and said, I'd like to join the Ukrainians and join the fight. So Roland doesn't come out with any political statements of any type. But what he basically said is, well, it's dangerous. It's going to be unpleasant. But the fact is, men are what the Ukrainians need most now. They need soldiers now. He doesn't go into any further comments about it, but I thought this was very interesting because here's a boots on the ground soldier who's been there for a long time. He's very aware of all these things. And he's not trying to discourage the guy who's a military newbie from going there and probably getting killed.
Yep.
Saying that the Ukrainians need men. This kind of underlines the fact that, as has been said, the Ukrainians have lost about 150,000 soldiers. That's a lot.
I've heard a cut numbers recently, Doug, as high as I heard Scott Ritter the other day suggest that the number was 325,000.
Good grief. That would not be deaths. That would be including
No, that's deaths.
Serious casualties.
No, this is deaths. This is the KIAs. I mean, and I don't.
If that's the case, then casualties would be 2 times that over again. Serious casualties.
Yep.
Wow.
Yep.
So, just from Roland's comment, it sounds like they really do need men.
Well, there's a document that was circulating online that was allegedly from Ukrainian government to employers, basically telling them that they had to report, they had to supply a list of any men on their payroll between 18 and 55. so that they could be pressed into service. So I asked my my assistant, who is Ukrainian, lives in Ukraine. I asked her if it was real, what it said, and whether or not it was legitimate. And she said, yeah, it is legitimate. And so you have people now, men who are refusing to take a job and refusing to sign up for unemployment, because both places gets you on the immediate, immediately set up to be for a press gang to come along and sweep you up. So yeah, they're actively picking up whoever they can right now and sending them to the front.
That's amazing. Well, American politicians, well, EU politicians should all be hung from lampposts, frankly, for financing and enabling this ridiculous and pointless border war between two shithole dictatorships. It's just really, really terrible. So anyway,
I had to say, when you for some reason, when you say what you just said in past episodes, it really triggers some of our viewers. When you refer to Russia as a shithole country, and specifically as a dictatorship, it just takes people who are normally very, very rational, and they get very spun up emotionally about it. So what would you say to those guys?
Pro-Russian or pro-Ukrainian or what?
I think
Zelensky.
I think they're clearly pro-Russian, or at least anti-Ukrainian, and they almost feel like you're making an equivalence between Zelensky and Putin, in terms of them being dictators, and in terms of the quality of the country,
Well, okay. Well, let me explain that in case any of them are listening now. I've been to Russia, God, at least starting in the 70s, half a dozen, 7, 8 times, and all over the country, east to west and north to south. Not that I'm a Russian expert, but let me say this. It's that Russia really is a third world country. Once you get out of Moscow and Leningrad, it's really backward. And as far as Putin's concerned, it's also shameful that he's being made into the new Hitler. Nice guy. Well, listen, you can't run a giant place like that, or any country, and be a nice guy. I mean, I'm sure he's been a bad boy, but not as bad boy as some of the people that run countries. And when you look at the facts, Putin has taken a country that, was falling apart in every way possible. And yeah, there's oligarchs and all this type of thing, but he cut the tax rate in Russia, to 10%, and in many ways cleaned the place up. But he's fighting against 1,000 years of Russian history, which has been nothing but, invasions and blood and nasty dictatorships, from Ivan the Terrible to Lenin and Stalin. It's very hard. Even if he was Ludwig von Mises, he would find it impossible to reform that country in a lifetime. That said, I'm on the Russian side of this thing. Yeah. The Russians, if I was a Martian, I'd say, yep, the Russians made a mistake probably in invading the Ukraine, but all things considered, they almost were forced to do it. So
yeah.
I don't know if I'm clear explaining myself there.
No, I think you are. I think a lot of people don't always hear that context within your explanation of things. But what do they, in terms of Putin's ability to clean stuff up there, fight, all the oligarchs and stuff like that, the US has done a really good job of helping him do things he couldn't have done on his own in the last year with the sanctions regime, because he was always fighting the oligarchs or trying to negotiate with them or really going directly after them. Well, the US seized their wealth. It went after them specifically, the oligarchs. He couldn't take their wealth, but the US did. So kind of handicapped his biggest rivals all of a sudden. And there was a certain class, the well-to-do people in St. Petersburg and in Moscow who had deep ties, deep connections with the West. And if he'd tried to sever those ties, to try and bring people more into the Russian fold, they would have rebelled. He would have had domestic problems, but the US cut him off, forced them out, pushed them away. And so we did more for Putin honestly, and he has a 1.5 million member military now that is going to be combat ready to take on all kinds of trouble around the world, so than any other military on earth after all this. So this has done the opposite of weaken Russia.
These are excellent points, Matt. You're absolutely correct. And
Well, most of them come from like Scott, right?
That's in addition to the fact that what the US is doing is acting to actively destroy what's left of the Ukraine and cement this, shameful little bedbug Zelensky further into office. So as usual, everything the US has done is not only not good, it's actively bad.
Yeah, I agree. All right, so you want to talk about this proposed Argentinian Brazilian currency merger? What's that about?
Well, let's dig into comedy a little bit here. Back in about, when was it? 2015, 2016, when I was still writing a newsletter per se, I actually did a study of who has more actively destroyed their national currency. Back in 1930, when I think I started this, looking at the exchange rates and so forth, both Brazil and Argentina issued gold coins for day-to-day use, and the peso, and it was the real at that time for Brazil, were both gold equivalent. And then, of course, they went crazy, reacting to the last depression and World War II and one thing or another. And of course, both countries have changed the names of their currencies numerous times over the succeeding 90 years. How many times? Brazil's had the Cruzado, the Cruzeiro. They're back to the real right now. Argentina has had the Austral, and then they had the heavy peso. I don't know, they changed. But anyway, the study that I did up until that time showed that both countries were neck and neck in the trillions of percent of destroying their various currencies. And of course, the Argentines have pulled ahead in recent years. So this is the comical thing about it. These are the two most monetarily stupid countries on the face of the planet, over not just making mistakes over a few years, but over decades as policy, national policy, destroying one currency after another. And now, like a couple of drunks trying to hold each other up on a street corner, they're going to have a new international currency based on what? I mean, this shows these people have no grip at all on what money's about or why anybody would want to use it. And then they've said, and we'd like to get the rest of South America, all of which are monetary disasters. Every country in South America has been a total monetary disaster, but they're the two worst. And they want to get them into a new.
Right, led by them.
Yeah, exactly. So, I mean, this is further proof that there's absolutely no hope. There's just no hope for the human race.
Do you think that the motivation for that now, it does surprise me now that they would do that. I mean, just because, it seemed like Lula was proposing it, and Lula, and I would imagine Brazilians, because most recently it's the Argentines that have done the worst with their currency, would look at that and be like, no, we don't want any part of that. Like, we don't want to be the people that bail them out. But it seemed like it came from Lula, didn't it? Or maybe I missed it.
I guess it did, but you have a criminal regime in Brazil and a criminal regime in Argentina. And I guess they can kind of see eye to eye on something.
Right. Well, I guess
but the business classes, the middle class and the upper middle classes of both countries, I think, are, just laughing about this. It's so stupid what their governments are doing.
Why would they do it then, though? What do you think the motivation is in the time of the timing?
Why are they doing it? Is it desperation? I don't know. Well, we're going to go to a barbecue on, or an asado, I should say, down here on Friday night with very locally knowledgeable and economically hip guy. And then
ask
next
him.
week, we're going to have lunch with an Argentine economist, believe it or not, an ANCAP over here. So we'll have more data as to exactly how can they possibly think this will work. Are they trying to do this now? I mean, I'm mystified.
Yeah, me too. The only thing I can think of is that, we do feel, it does feel like the zeitgeist of the day a little bit, at least from the central bank's perspective, is a currency reset. I mean, it does seem like it's on the horizon. If nothing else, the conversion to the central bank digital currencies, which you've talked about, we've talked about a lot. So
Yep.
maybe it's that becomes the predicate for rolling out a CBDC between them. Maybe it's easier to accept under those terms of some more economic promise somehow.
Yeah, maybe they will try to justify it by saying that it's part of the big plan.
Right.
And you got to have a big plan in order to.
The big plans are always the good plans.
Yes,
you know that.
That's right. Well, we'll find out more in the next week, but these people are criminally insane. It's just, but on the bright side, they leave the average guy alone pretty much in both of those countries I've found. So
yeah, it's true.
Yeah.
Well, in light of this currency reset, we talked about something offline yesterday about this letter that I found sent out from a Fed official in December 19th, 1918, just after World War I, talking about gold and Federal Reserve notes. So I wanted to get into that and just show people that, because I think there's something interesting that's happening there that you might be able to relate to what's happening today. But for those who don't know, because most people don't have any sense of history, especially monetary history, can you just explain how money was different 100 years ago, or about that time? Let's say right around World War I.
Yeah, it is rather amazing. People don't realize that gold coins were used in day-to-day commerce before the 1930s, before 1933, when Roosevelt changed all of that. And this was true almost every place in the world, quite frankly, including Argentina and Brazil, as I just mentioned. People realized that gold was money, and the paper, the banknotes that they had in their wallets, were just receipts for gold because they were more convenient. And of course, since you didn't want to have to carry gold coins around with you, or for that matter, bills around with you, you deposit them in a bank and just trade checks against them in the bank. Now, this gets into the difference between savings accounts and checking accounts, which are two totally different things, two totally different businesses even, that a bank which offers savings should not actually offer checking, or they should be totally separated. And of course, they're totally merged at this point. This is a long story, not a complex story, and not even a long story, but maybe one that maybe I don't want to go into explaining the difference between the.
Yeah, that's fine. But what just about the people used paper though, but the paper was different fundamentally because it was a gold certificate or gold receipt or something like that. And
it used to say that right on the currency in the U.S. gold receipt, payable on demand at the U.S. Treasury, $10 in gold. And you can still buy them in the collectible market. Yes.
Yeah.
So
you can see some of them online. You can just Google it and you can see pictures of them. That's how I found them at first. But
and of course, there's so many changes that have been made over the years in the banking system. Like in a Western movie, you'll notice that when somebody like Jesse James or any bank robber rode into a town to rob the bank, well, today if somebody robs a bank, nobody gives a damn. I mean, the locals who might deposit in the bank, they don't care. I mean, and why should they care? It's all insured by the federal government. It's not going to cost them anything regardless. But in the old days, that was their money placed into the bank in the terms of gold. And when it was robbed, somebody else had it and it was gone. And it was, so that's why the townsmen came out and fought the bank robbers.
Right.
It was a direct one-to-one theft. So the whole society has been corrupted in many ways.
Yeah. Yeah. So, and I think this corruption of value is a big underlying part of it all. And this letter, let me actually see if I can bring this up on my screen. I'll share it with people here.
That would be interesting.
So this letter, not sure how well people can see it. I hope they can see it okay. But essentially, this is from a director of sales for the Fed, sent out to all the different banks. And what the letter says fundamentally is it says that, it's become harder at this time in 1918, apparently, to find actual gold in the market. Before this point, it was relatively easy, essentially for, they were having a harder time. So they were trying to encourage the banks to redouble their efforts, the commercial banks to redouble their efforts to actually get people to deposit their actual gold within the bank. Because they had a plan, it says, actually, I'll just read you what it says here, the quote on it. It says, every dollar of gold, either a coin or certificate that is possible to obtain has been placed in reserve. Furthermore, they say the Federal Reserve notes are intended to take the place as circulation of gold coin and gold certificates. They are the development of a scientific plan. So, which the scientific plan thing has new meaning to me now, given everything that's happened with the COVID hysteria. But I think the interesting thing here is that it's like at this time, and if you read the whole letter, and I'll post it so people can get it in the description of this video, they talk specifically about the fact that the gold is worth much more in the possession and the reserves of the central bank, much more than it would be in the hands of citizens. And essentially because it increased the creditworthiness of the US. And so they had a specific plan, and they were doing this. They're encouraging people to voluntarily exchange their gold and sort of adopt these Federal Reserve notes instead. So they're trying to push that. And so they did it with the carrot and encouragement at first. And it wasn't until 1933 that then they used the stick, where you couldn't use gold anymore and you had to all use these Federal Reserve notes. But so that's what this letter was all about. And I guess it was this idea, along with Doug, when I heard you on Daniela's podcast, the Stansbury podcast, talking about how you really believed that gold was going to see a new, come into new renown, I guess, because with the rollout of these central bank digital currencies. So you went into a good rant about that. And I thought, and so that made me think. And then this one other data point I remember seeing a few weeks ago, and that was that central banks were accumulating gold once again. So this is apparently it's the largest accumulation of gold by central banks since 1950. So it made me think, maybe, just like in 1918, the central banks realized that if they wanted, creditworthiness was going to be really important in the future. Maybe they saw a currency reset on the horizon. Maybe the scientific plan to move everyone into the fiat system altogether was already there, like now how the central bank digital currency plan is on the table. And they knew in order to make it credible, they were going to have value within the reserves, real value. And that real value is gold. And most of that gold exists in the public market. And so central banks are going out voluntarily and acquiring it wherever they can right now, in anticipation, I think, of this currency reset. Doug, what do you think of that?
I think you're absolutely right, because as I know I pointed out in the past, most of the countries in the world don't only use the US dollar to settle between each other because everybody else uses it and it's convenient. And if you're going to transfer money from one country to another, it basically uses a SWIFT system and clears through New York. So if the Chinese want to buy something from the Russians, well, at least until recently, I don't know what they're doing now, but they were using dollars that would go through New York, go from Beijing to Moscow, which is absolutely insane with an adversary country, and one that is increasingly unreliable, and one that's manifestly bankrupt. So what are they going to do? Do they really trust each other? Do the Chinese want to have a lot of Russian rubles? Probably not. And the Russians don't want to have a lot of Chinese yuan either. So what are they going to settle with? Can't use dollars, can't use their own currencies. Well, they're not going to use Indian rupees either. So it's going to go back to gold. They're going to go back to what gold has always been used for. It's a medium of exchange. It's a store of value. It's money. And that's what they're doing now. So, and as I pointed out to Daniela yesterday on this interview, and I think I've said it here before, when I was in Zimbabwe last, which was, must have been 2016 or something like that, I spent a lot of time with Gideon Gono, who was the head of the Central Bank of Zimbabwe. Quite a bit of time, actually. And he gave me a paper that he'd written. You'd think that he would be a drooling idiot having printed a $100 trillion note. But he explained, we had no choice. We had to pay the army. We had to give them something. And he's right. You got to pay the soldiers first. But he wrote a paper on why Zimbabwe should have a gold Zimbabwe dollar. And he was trying to sell Comrade Mugabe on it. He didn't succeed, of course.
Yeah.
But, Gideon wasn't a drooling idiot at all. He was actually a very smart guy. Other problems, but still. So, and of course, nobody, I don't even know what, if Zimbabwe is using a currency again now or not. They've done a couple of things since they destroyed that last one. But nobody's going to take anything issued by the government or the Central Bank of Zimbabwe. So they're going to have to use gold. And all these countries and governments are going to have to use gold. They could use silver too, for that matter. It wouldn't be as convenient.
And it could be some, some gold certificate type thing, right? It's not like you have to ship airplane loads of gold back and forth for every transaction. I mean, there's more, technologically efficient ways that they could accomplish it, I imagine, right?
Well, that's right. At the Federal Reserve Bank in New York, there are many, many millions of ounces of gold that are stored, that are owned by other governments and other central banks, so they can clear with each other. Now, I don't know how much that's done anymore, quite frankly, because gold has been pretty well squeezed out of the system. But even to this day, the Venezuelans still have gold, apparently, at the New York Fed. And I think they tried to get it, but the US wouldn't give it to them.
Well, and they did that recently with Russia, with some of their, at least their central bank reserves.
So, if I was a foreign government, I would politely and slowly, but very definitely move my gold out of storage in the US, where, of course, governments used to settle with each other, because you don't want to constantly be shipping gold bars back and forth to settle things up. You just use it as a bank. Yeah. So I think it's all going to change. And this is why you want to own gold coins in your own possession, even though gold is, I think, kind of reasonably priced relative to everything that you might want to buy. It's, this example has been around for many, many, many years. A first-class meal for 4 people would cost about a gold sovereign, 1/4 of an ounce of gold. A first-class men's suit would cost a sovereign, 1/4 of an ounce of gold, things like that. And we're pretty much at that level. I think the price of gold is reasonable, historically speaking, but I think it's going a lot higher because we're looking at a real monetary crisis, monetary panic in the future. And gold will go far above what it should be historically. I mean, things get reset. Look at silver, for instance. For many years, we've had many, many years, we've had a whole coterie of people who are silver bugs. And they thought that because the US government set the ratio between gold and silver, when we had a bimetallic system in this country, it was 17-1, I think. And they thought, well, that's what it should be. But that's not what it should be. You can't set the ratio between two commodities. I mean, as far as archaeologists have been able to determine, in Egypt, silver used to be about, gold used to be about 2.5 times per ounce more than silver in value. So things change. So now it's about what, 80-1. I don't know what it should be. I think silver is probably a really good bargain right now. But some people looked at silver like, well, you know, some kind of a magic element.
Well, like doggy coin.
Yeah, exactly. Nothing wrong with silver. It's just, there's a lot of reasons why it's just not as good a money as gold is.
Yeah, well, especially if you're looking at, I mean, there are different central banks in the past have used silver as a reserve and gold as a reserve, right? Or one or the other. But it does seem like the gold or the silver ones always had more trouble. But I'm not unclear on that history around that. Why does one prefer one or the other?
Yeah, well, we used to have a bimetallic standard in this country, which was a mistake, having a fixed ratio between gold and silver.
Yep.
Which we had in this country for many years. And people vaguely remember a politician in the era of Teddy Roosevelt named William Jennings Bryan, who had this speech that he was out stumping with when he wanted to be president, called "You Shall Not Crucify Mankind on a Cross of Gold." And he was basically arguing for making silver. There's a huge surplus of silver at the time, and it was a way of inflating, but inflating by using a cheaper metal that was in great abundance. So this kind of thing has gone on forever, where people have played with the money supply in different ways.
Right. Yeah. The way I remember that was I mean, he hadn't imagined a whole fiat system. So, so you couldn't imagine the real benefit of being able to just fully print money. But this was a big step if they brought in silver as the core reserve instead of gold, right?
And even going back to ancient times, the Romans generally used the silver denarius as their actual money. And they had a gold aureus in those days. And it wasn't used much as money. They preferred silver. I'm not sure exactly why that's the case. But then later, when it became the Byzantine Empire, after Constantine, about 325, he reformed the monetary system, and silver went out, and they used what was called the gold solidus. And that stayed a solid money for many centuries thereafter. So you can use gold, you can use silver. The Mexicans have always seemed to have preferred silver.
Right. And I think the Chinese did as well, right?
The Chinese did as well. So you can use either one. And just a couple of little factettes that I'll mention here, not factoids. We don't want any of those. There's roughly, I don't know, it's gold production's going down at the moment, but there's about 80 million, 90 million ounces of gold produced every year, and about 800 or 900 million ounces of silver. In other words, about 10 times more ounces of silver are produced than ounces of gold every year. And so does that mean anything as far as what the value of the money should be? Well, if new supply counted, well, I guess you'd say gold ought to be only 10 times more valuable than silver, because there's only 1/10 as much produced. But that's not the way it is, because all the silver is basically consumed. Almost all of it's consumed. It's not stored the way gold is, but almost all the gold that's produced is stored. So it's never as simple as some people think it is. Could you use either gold or silver? Yeah, you could use either one easily. And of course, you could say you could use Bitcoin too. Although I've got a problem with Bitcoin because you can't hold it in your hand. And its only use is as a transfer mechanism. So I think it qualifies as a money. And I was slow to adopt it because it took me a while to figure out what's the use of this thing. How's it better than doggy coin? You could use doggy coin if it had characteristics of Bitcoin. It couldn't be created in a centralized way and all that. So you can use anything as money, frankly. But there are certain limits. And how many times have I mentioned that? Look, there's 5 characteristics that Aristotle defined for money: durable, divisible, convenient, consistent, have value of itself. Durable. That's why we don't use wheat as money. Doesn't last. Divisible. That's why we don't use artwork as money. Can't make change for the Mona Lisa, cutting it up. Convenient. That's why we don't use lead as money. You could, but it's not very good money. Durable, divisible, convenient, consistent. That's why you don't use real estate as money, because every piece of property is different from the other. And the last is it has to have use value, so you don't get stuck holding the bag with it. And I had a problem with Bitcoin for a long time. What's the use value? Well, it's got great use value. It's to transfer cheaply and quickly across borders and privacy, lots of advantages. Okay, that solves the use value thing. And of course, the last thing is that Aristotle didn't think of because it wasn't on the table back then, is it can't be created out of nothing, right, which is why you don't use paper as money.
Right. Or digits, even worse.
Even worse. That's why you shouldn't use them. So this is all gonna blow up. It's all gonna, either we go to a complete police state, which is possible at this point, or the whole table is reset.
Seems like a big part of that's going to reset is happening. Klaus wants it in a certain way, and I'm sure lots of people would like to see it in a different way, but it seems like a reset is on the agenda. And I think when you talk about the gold and silver debate, I mean, they're both, I think, good. Silver is probably better speculation right now, just because of its pricing, I'm just guessing. But,
I think so. Yeah.
But if you're looking at which one's going to be used as money, I mean, if you follow what the central banks are doing, who are going to be key factors in determining what the world perceives as money, then it's gold, right? Based upon the way that they're growing the reserves.
I think it's going to be gold, right? And you can have a bimetallic system where the prices, when you go to buy a loaf of bread at the store, you could have price in gold, price in silver, and it would fluctuate daily. But that's kind of inconvenient, especially in a, so anything could happen.
Yeah,
but,
I think sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, this may be academic. If Der Schwabenklaus and his buddies at WEF turn the world into some type of a fascist police state, and
you're still going to need
have economic reality on our side. So
exactly, they're still going to need people who need to trade.
But they've got, the great mass of people believe that, these rich and powerful and well-educated people, they believe them, as far as that's the way the world. It could go either way, I think.
Yeah. Okay, just one other idea I want to run by you real quick, is we were talking about culturally in different places. There's in the cultural history, there's a reception of silver or gold as money. So like in China, again, silver is seen as probably perceived more as money than gold is. In India, it's probably gold, I'm guessing, and Mexico, silver certainly is, as you said, it's has historical significance. So, but in Uruguay, it's almost impossible to find silver. It doesn't really even exist. I mean, there's not many people here. Silver coins are not common here. So
it's funny because here we are on the Rio de la Plata, which is
yeah,
the Silver River, and right across the border is Argentina, and of course, Argentum is Latin for silver. So
and there's no silver.
There's no silver. It's really funny. Well, it's one of the problems with Uruguay is that importing gold or silver is problematical here. You're supposed to pay a duty, you're supposed to declare it. This is really stupid for a country that, insofar as any country in Latin America can pretend to be Switzerland, this place used to be the Switzerland of South America.
Well, one thing we had a friend recently, Doug, who brought multiple 6 figures of gold into the country. He brought it in personally from the US. He had to sign out of it in the US. He declared it on the way out, and he declared on the way in here. There were no duties or anything.
Maybe it's
It was
just
a
on
hassle.
silver. There's duties on silver then, isn't there?
That's
There's
what it is.
duties on
Yeah.
something.
Maybe
there.
silver. Maybe silver. Yeah, could make sense. But gold, it was a hassle for him, and that he had to personally bring it. It's much harder. I found it very difficult to have a broker do it on your behalf, just to order it and bring it in. But he did it on his person, and he had to spend extra time at the airport on both ends to deal with it. But he brought in quite a bit.
Interesting.
Yeah. So
Interesting.
it can be done.
Yeah, it can be. One of the problems with Uruguay is that there's no exchange, or there aren't even any coin shops that make a market in these things. In Argentina, up until about, it was 10 years ago, it used to be quite simple and easy to buy gold in Argentina, but then the Kirchnerites did something that have made it very hard, and it's not easy anymore. So it's like everywhere there are more rules, there are more regulations every single day as far as what you can do and what it costs to do it.
Well, especially, maybe that might be an entrepreneurial opportunity for somebody coming into Uruguay, because there's, maybe creating a market for gold coins. Maybe there is a reasonable business around it here. Maybe it could be done, especially as you get more Westerners moving in.
Yeah, there might be. Of course, I think it would have to be almost a hobby business to start with.
Yeah.
The average guy, even the average American, forget about the average Uruguayan, just doesn't understand anything about money or economics. Or, sorry to be so depressed at this. It seems like a hopeless situation.
Yeah, but we're surrounded by a lot of people who do understand those things, and who would them alone would create enough demand to justify, I think, a hobby operation in making a market for gold here. But
yeah, and here in Latin America, there is this phrase "plata o plomo," which is to say silver or lead, which is when you're giving somebody an offer you can't refuse. So they understand the value of silver.
Yeah, that's true. I guess that's true. Yeah. All right, Doug. Well, we'll leave it there. We'll be back on Friday. Thank you very much. I appreciate today. It's a good time.
Pleasure, Matt. Thank you.